Herb, you're on mute.
Welcome everyone today to our second installment of the 2020 JDI Roundtable on Manufacturing Competitiveness in New Brunswick. I'm very pleased to welcome today Dr. Andrew Sharp, who's the Executive Director for the Center for the Study of Living Standards in Ottawa, Ontario. Andrew's organization has been at the forefront and leadership of productivity studies for Canada and its provinces. Their reputation for working with detailed data and understanding big pictures and the comparative contexts across provinces and across nations is extremely valuable, and we're excited today to learn about what he can show us as an overview of the state of innovation and research and development in our province and how that's linking up to productivity and a bit on how productivity and manufacturing in particular. So before I turn it over to Andrew, as we only have our 1 hour today, I'd like to call for first, we're going to have 3 poll questions coming up through the webinar. I'd like the first one to come up now. These are unfair questions. You could agree with parts of all of them, but I'm asking you to pick the one that most agrees with how you view things. And it's mostly just so we can get some thinking going on some of the themes that will be coming up through the presentation. So if you could take a look at those options. For a small province like New Brunswick, research and development is A, vital to perform here so we can capture the benefits. B, good to do but not essential since we can free ride on other provinces and countries that are already investing in R&D. And C, completely unnecessary since the best ideas from around the globe are available for free and readily acquired by businesses that can benefit from them. So if you could pick one of those, that would be great. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to get organized and begin his presentation. He will go through his slides and then we will use the Q&A function in Zoom, and I will curate the questions to Andrew and give him a chance to answer. And as you can see, we have an audience today that believes that R&D is vital to perform here so we can capture the benefits. So we're off to a good start already, Andrew. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Herb. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. The presentation is entitled "Innovation in New Brunswick and Productivity in New Brunswick." It's based on a research report that we released in September by Kimberly Wong, who is an economist at the Center, is now at the University of Toronto as a graduate student. And so I have 5 basically sections that I want to talk about. First, I'll talk about the introduction. Then I want to talk about the state of innovation in New Brunswick, looking particularly at a number of indicators. And then I'll talk about productivity performance in New Brunswick and linkages between innovation and productivity and policy implications of findings. I don't have a lot of time, only half an hour or so, so I'll have to go fairly quickly. And I'll focus particularly on the second one, on the state of innovation in New Brunswick, and I'll have less detail to say on the other sections, although I'll certainly be able to take questions at the end of the end. Okay, now, first off, innovation. There's a number of metrics of innovation, and we go through them all in the report. The most important is probably R&D. That's certainly the major one that people look at. It's an indication of the creation of new techniques, processes, and products. And then there's also patents, surveys of innovation, investment, data, and also business entry. So I'll look quickly at all those with the most attention on R&D. Now, we have good R&D data in Canada, largely through the tax credit system. Firms that do R&D can get a tax credit, so they have an incentive to provide that information to the government. Now, there's basically 3 types of three major types of R&D in terms of who performs it and who funds it. Business both performs and funds R&D, as does government and higher education. We're looking at R&D from a performance basis. So the first slide I have in front of you shows you how much R&D is done in Canada by government, higher education, and business on a per capita basis. That's a little bit different than looking at it as the share of the economy. And if you look at it on a per capita basis, New Brunswick does very bad. It's basically the last in terms of total R&D per capita. Now, what about the 3 components? Well, it's last in business R&D, only at $146 per capita per year in 2017, which is the most recent year for which data available. It basically has more in higher education. That's the most important performer of R&D at $344. And then, but it's still last in higher education on all products. In terms of government is a smaller performer of R&D, only around $61 per capita, but New Brunswick is not last among the provinces, at least in that sector. Okay, turning now to R&D as a share of GDP. This is a standard way to look at it. It's called R&D intensity. And New Brunswick actually is second last of the provinces here. Saskatchewan does poorer. As you notice, Saskatchewan has a higher GDP per capita than New Brunswick. That's why basically it did better in the absolute, even though it does worse in the total per capita. And again, in business, New Brunswick now is not last. It's basically only third last. Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador do work. Also, New Brunswick is not last in higher education. It's basically a third last, and it's about in the middle of government. So looking at intensity provides a basically more favorable perspective on R&D performance in New Brunswick than looking at it on a per capita basis, because New Brunswick's income level is below that of most other provinces. Now, in terms of the share of R&D, as I mentioned, of the three sectors, government, business, and higher education, New Brunswick has a relatively high percentage of its R&D done by government. Not a lot in absolute terms, only 11%, but compared to other provinces, it's quite high. New Brunswick, again, it's higher education that accounts for more than half of R&D done in New Brunswick, as you see there. It's number third in that proportion. And in terms of business, it's basically about fourth last, about a third of R&D in New Brunswick is done by business. So New Brunswick has a very strong slant towards higher education R&D. Okay. Now, it's really interesting to look at R&D done by industry. Unfortunately, there's a major problem here because of the size of R&D. The actual current dollar value of R&D in New Brunswick is relatively small. It's only $133 million in 2016. So whereas for Canada, we have a very detailed breakdown of R&D in the business sector done by industry. We really don't have quite the same thing for New Brunswick. You'll see there we have data basically on utilities, construction, service sector, and ICT. And it's not really a detailed breakdown as it is at the national level for Canada. So that's really unfortunate. It would allow us to know, there's two issues here. Is it the industrial structure of New Brunswick that explains its lower R&D compared to the national average? Or is it that for a given industry, there's just less R&D done in New Brunswick compared to other provinces? We have some idea of that. It's basically a combination of the two, but the most important one is we found that's the industrial structure. The ICT sector is smaller in New Brunswick than it is in other provinces. New Brunswick doesn't have industries such as pharmaceuticals, aeronautics that have very high R&D intensity. So the industrial structure definitely hurts the New Brunswick's business sector R&D performance, but it can't explain it all. Now, what's been happening over time in terms of R&D? Here's a time trend in terms of the intensity of R&D. So that's the key issue, is basically New Brunswick doing better or not. So here you'll see Canada and the national and New Brunswick. So looking at the beginning at the top, we see that, well, overall, Canada has about double the R&D intensity of New Brunswick. And you'll see that Canada has actually been on a slight downward trend since 2000, since the high-tech boom in 2000. We're actually doing relatively poor total. Now, however, New Brunswick is a little bit up since 2000, It is up since the first part of the series, but so there's basically not in that sense, it's not as if the R&D situation in New Brunswick is deteriorating. It's basically stagnant. Now, if we look at the different components, we see that business R&D, note in Canada, business R&D is really on a downward trend. It's really a very poor aspect of Canada's economic performance, business R&D. In New Brunswick, there's been a little bit of upward trend in the 2000s, and then some downward trend, and now it's on, until recently, it's been an upward trend. So there's not the same downward trend, at least in business R&D in New Brunswick, that we see at the national level. Turning over to government R&D, again, we see there's a downward trend in both New Brunswick and Canada. And then in higher education, again, an upward trend, a very strong upward trend if you look at the early period compared to now. So in that sense, there's basically strong upward trend in higher education R&D, downward trend in government, and stability in business sector R&D. That's kind of the situation in New Brunswick for trends. Now, we can also look at R&D personnel, and we see again the similar story. New Brunswick has much fewer R&D personnel per capita or for the total as a share of total employment compared to Canada. And there's been a downward trend in New Brunswick, slight downward trend as there has been nationally. Again, the downward trend is particularly pronounced in business personnel in R&D, and New Brunswick has a much smaller share of business R&D as a share of business R&D and personnel in total employment compared to Canada. And then it's about the same in government and higher education, a little bit lower in higher education. But overall, it's the gap. There's just not a lot of people in the business sector in New Brunswick performing R&D. And it's also on a slight downward trend since 2007 to 2013. Unfortunately, for some reason, this series only, Statistics Canada doesn't seem to produce this series beyond 2013, which is unfortunate. Okay, let's turn now to patents. Well, as you would not be surprised, New Brunswick has a very small number of patents. According to in 2016, according to the U.S. Patent Office, which is the main office in which patents are filed by Canadians, only 35 patents were filed by residents of New Brunswick. Compared, that's basically out of 4,713 in Canada. And that accounts for about 0.7% of the overall patents in Canada. That's well below New Brunswick's share of the overall population. So patents is, there's very few patents done in New Brunswick. But basically, the good news is that there's actually an upward trend in patents. There was hardly any patents back in the 80s, 4, 8, and then there's been a peak in 97, and then it was down, and then now it's gone up again up to around 30, 40. So in that sense, that's positive. There seems to be more patent activity going on in New Brunswick, but it's still a very small share of the national average and well below the share of New Brunswick in the overall population of Canada. But at least it's on an upward trend. That's kind of a positive. Now, another as I said, metric of innovation is innovation surveys. Here's Statistics Canada asks firms, did you engage in innovative activity in the past period? And that's defined as the introduction of new products, the development of new products, where you're first in the world or first in the region, or first for the firm. And the bottom line is that firms are asked to define how innovative they are. And the proportion of firms in Atlantic Canada that define themselves as innovative is around 69%, whereas it's about 79% in other provinces. That's a fair high percentage of firms, but it's less in Atlantic Canada. Unfortunately, we don't have the data. The sample size is not large enough to provide data for New Brunswick, but I would expect that the situation in New Brunswick is similar to that in the overall Atlantic region. So by that perspective, firms are are less innovative in Atlantic Canada. Now, the final indicator I'm looking at is, or second final, is innovation, business investment. And there's different, investment is important for innovation because the most recent technologies are often embodied in machines and particular. Now, investment is different types. There's machinery and equipment, there's non-residential buildings, there's intellectual property rights. And it's machinery and equipment that's particularly relevant for productivity advance. From that perspective, the share of nominal GDP that goes to investment, at least in machinery and equipment, is relatively high in New Brunswick. It's around, as you see there, around 6%. It's the third highest of the provinces. So from that perspective, New Brunswick doesn't seem to be having a major problem in investment for machinery and equipment. Now, where New Brunswick is weak, it's also high in non-residential buildings, but that's really not as relevant for productivity. What the second type of investment that's relevant for productivity is the intellectual property rights. And again, here, basically New Brunswick does poorly, third lowest, only Manitoba and Prince Edward Island are weaker. Now, in terms of trends over time, again, basically there's been a slight downward trend in machinery and equipment investment. So that's an issue. Intellectual property rights, there has been an upward trend over time, both in Canada and New Brunswick. Now, intellectual property rights is an interesting concept. It basically includes three types of expenditure. Mineral exploration and evaluation, which is not directly relevant to productivity, but is considered an intellectual property right. On this one, New Brunswick does poorly. It's one of the worst of the provinces in terms of its expenditure as a share of GDP. Then research and development, well, I've already mentioned that. This is a slight different definition than earlier data, but again, the same results. Although it's quite interesting, Alberta does worse than New Brunswick on this measure of R&D, but New Brunswick is weak on that one. And then the software investment. And then this one, New Brunswick does quite well. It actually ranks basically third among the provinces, only Ontario and Quebec. This is expenditure by business on software, and it seems to be fairly, I guess the software industry in New Brunswick is relatively strong, at least. So that, okay, the next final metric is business entry rates. The idea here is that it's often the new businesses that are innovative, and the businesses that are not innovative end up leaving the industry. So we have both a gross entry rate and a net entry rate. Now, the idea is business dynamism is positive for innovation, and the more entry, that's positive. On this metric, New Brunswick does poorly. It ranks only second last, basically. Only Quebec does worse. So there's not a lot of new businesses being formed in New Brunswick compared to other jurisdictions. In terms of net entry, it's the same. There's still a very, at least it's positive, unlike negative in Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador in 2017, but it's very low. So in that sense, there's the rate of business dynamism in New Brunswick seems to be well below that of most other provinces. Okay, now that's just a quick overview of innovation metrics in New Brunswick. What about the factors affecting this innovation? Overall, I think you conclude that the province's innovative performance is weak, but there are some signs of progress in certain areas like patents. So there's many factors that affect innovation, and I'll just go through them and maybe we can have some discussion of this at the end of what is particularly important for New Brunswick. I already mentioned the issue of industrial structure, and there's no doubt that's one key reason why New Brunswick has less R&D than other provinces. Just does not have the highly intensive R&D industries such as pharmaceuticals or aerospace. But how much of that? Certainly, it's not the overall explanation. It's probably the most important explanation. Another factor is access to capital. The idea that small entrepreneurs that are not able to access capital to undertake R&D to develop products and processes. That may or may not be an issue. Some people, there's a debate on that. Some people think that there's just not the opportunities there. So if there were the opportunities, there would be the capital that would be available. Another one that comes up a lot is the innovation culture and attitudes towards risk. This is often used as an explanation of why Canada performs less R&D than the United States, and it can be used in why New Brunswick performs less R&D than Canada. The idea that there's a more conservative business culture. There may be some truth in that. Attitude towards innovation by entrepreneurs may be different between New Brunswick and other provinces. Another factor is the supply of highly skilled labor. If you really want, it's not like there's a supply of labor from Stanford University that Silicon Valley had, or Waterloo for our high-tech hubs in Canada. There are, of course, so many highly skilled people in Land Canada, but maybe not the critical mass that you would have for starting a high-tech R&D intensive industry in other jurisdictions. So that's an issue. The business environment, that's the idea that there's regulations that are hostile to the development of new businesses that are R&D intensive. There's, I think, mixed evidence on that one. The peripheral location is I think, an important factor. And communications. Basically, New Brunswick, its population size is small. It's on the eastern part of Canada, away from the center. The connections by air are weak and getting weaker, and a lot of it's important to be able to travel quickly if you're running a high-tech company, and getting to New Brunswick can be time-consuming. So the peripheral location can be a disadvantage in installing R&D operations in New Brunswick. Research-intensive universities, UNB is a very good university, but it doesn't have the research intensity of, say, the University of Toronto or McGill, or even, say, Dalhousie. So it's not as research intensive as some of the major research intensities in Canada. That may be a factor in terms of generating spillovers to business. The tax system may be another factor. There is an R&D credit, but given by the provincial government, but it's much smaller than the R&D tax credit given by the Quebec government, for example. So, or maybe the overall rate of corporate taxation is not suitable for high-tech businesses. Business university linkages are recognized as important for R&D development innovation. They certainly exist, but maybe the number and the intensity is less than it is in other high-tech jurisdictions. Immigration also can be a factor in innovation, because often it's immigrants who become the entrepreneurs, or the children of immigrants. And on this score, New Brunswick has a very small proportion of immigrants. Just to show you the international immigration by province, well, New Brunswick is third last in terms of the number of immigrants compared to the population in 2018, 2019. Now, I know there's a great recognition of the importance of immigrants in New Brunswick, and I think that's changing. But it's hard because, again, the networks of immigrants are much weaker there, so it's harder to attract immigrants to New Brunswick. And the economic opportunities have been less than in other parts of the country. But it certainly recognizes an important area for the future. Okay, going now to labor productivity. I'll do that fairly quickly here. Now, the issue is, we know there's a link between innovation and productivity. If you look at the standard models of labor productivity growth, there's basically three sources of labor productivity growth. Improved quality of human capital, increased capital per worker, capital intensity, and then what's called total factor productivity, which is supposedly a measure of technological change. And technological change is linked to R&D, linked to the introduction of best practice techniques. So in that sense, there's a strong link between productivity and innovation. Now, how has New Brunswick been doing in terms of productivity? Well, actually, there's two stories here. At the all industries level, it's basically not bad. It's about comparable. You'll see here that labor productivity growth was by 1.12% per year from 97 to 2009. and New Brunswick, and it was 1.18%. So hardly any difference. So in that sense, New Brunswick does not have a productivity growth problem at the level of the total economy. It has a productivity problem in the sense that the level of productivity is lower, and we'll talk about that later. And also, if you look at other sectors, it's going to be a problem. We're doing a study right now on manufacturing productivity, and there actually is a greater problem. Productivity growth in New Brunswick has been significantly lower than it has been in Canada in manufacturing, but that's not the case for the overall economy. And of course, it's the overall economy, the productivity growth rate in the overall economy, that drives living standards down the road. So that's positive that New Brunswick has done, basically comparable to the national average. Now, however, where does New Brunswick fall down? Labor productivity is a function of, it's basically the difference between output growth and labor input growth. And you'll see here that there's great differences between New Brunswick and Canada in those areas. Output growth has been much stronger in Canada than in New Brunswick since '97, around 2.4% per year compared to 1.5, almost a full percentage point slower growth in New Brunswick. New Brunswick particularly had slower growth in recent years. And that growth, if there's slower growth, there's two sources of growth: productivity and labor input. And then you look at labor input, or employment, or proxied by hours. They're almost the same thing, because average hours worked is pretty stable over time. Whereas hours worked was up 1.2%. In Canada, it was only up 0.4% in New Brunswick. So basically, and therefore, you subtract those and you see that. So the explanation for this is that the pace, to the degree that labor productivity is largely driven by technological change in the long run. So over long periods, if we have the same, relatively speaking, the same pace of technological change in New Brunswick than in Canada, even though the level of technological progress may be lower in New Brunswick, the rate of growth is the same, then the overall productivity growth rate is the same, and it's just lower income in New Brunswick. And so the key question is, why has economic growth been so slow in New Brunswick compared to the national average? And then we get into, well, what's been the economic opportunities in New Brunswick? It hasn't had the boom like Newfoundland and Labrador had in the oil industry, or Alberta until fairly recently, oil and gas, diamonds, and Northwest Territories. There's been no driver of the New Brunswick economy that could have resulted in strong growth rates. And if you didn't have those economic opportunities, you're not going to have the economic growth, and therefore you're not. You won't have the employment growth, but it will not greatly affect your productivity, because that's largely the underlying technological progress that determines that. Now, in terms of, again, we can do this. We can do this for the business sector and the non-business sector and the total economy. I won't get into that. I'll just show you the overall levels here. I mentioned that the growth rate was the same for Canada and New Brunswick for labor productivity since '97. However, this is the level of productivity. How does New Brunswick compare to Canada? And again, here we see that the business sector you have the total economy, which is above the business sector, then the non-business sector, which is a very high. The non-business sector, we just measure productivity there really by the value of inputs, which is largely wages. And therefore, it has around 90% or so of the national average, whereas the business sector labor productivity is only around 75% of the national average. And it's been it's relatively stable over time. It's down. It's not really had any major changes. This is again the level of productivity here, and I mentioned that New Brunswick was below the national average. Here you see it's. This is the absolute level in dollars. The average level of productivity in New Brunswick is $48, 2012 dollars. And you see that much higher in Alberta, $80 overall. So New Brunswick is the third lowest. Only Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia have lower levels of labor productivity. Again, this is the growth rate of how is New Brunswick done in terms of growth rate. Well, it's actually, it's been comparable to the national average. I mentioned that before. Here you see that it's about in the middle of the provinces. So in that sense, it hasn't done worse than, certainly it's done better actually than Ontario and Quebec and Alberta and Nova Scotia. and it's done worse than the other provinces. So in that sense, it's not a growth rate problem as much as the level problem. Now, I've got some data here on the actual detail. I won't kind of have time to go into that. Here's the levels here. One key thing about productivity is there's basically very large variation across industries. This is in part due to capital intensity. If you have very high and capital intensive industries like utilities, you're going to have a very high level of output per hour, whereas low capital intensive industries like services, accommodation have a very low levels of productivity. So you see a very, very wide range of levels of productivity across industries. And then here, these are how does New Brunswick do relative to the national average at the particular levels? Well, here you'll see that there's actually 5 industries that have a productivity level in New Brunswick above the national average. Utilities, okay, real estate, agriculture, information, and educational services. And then you'll see that there's particularly low levels of productivity in manufacturing, wholesale trade, mining, and accommodation. So again, so there's a very different performance depending on the sector relative to the national average. And again, the same thing, just as there's different levels of productivity across sectors, there's very different growth rates. So we see that the agricultural sector did very well in terms of its productivity growth rate, whereas the mining sector was negative. So very, very different performances. Okay, now what about linkages between innovation and productivity? Well, I'll just make 4 comments here. First off, it's process innovation that basically, there's 2 types of R&D, development of new products and development of new processes for production. Now, the process innovation leads directly to a productivity performance improvement. You can see that you develop a new tool, and that tool will lead to less labor needed for a particular task. That's a direct labor productivity and performance. You develop a new product, well, that doesn't directly affect production, but the new product leads to increased sales and employment, and that indirectly can lead to productivity performance through economies of scale. And of course, it leads to increased employment and income as well. So R&D is important, not just for productivity, but also for just economic growth in general. A key point is that it's the diffusion of best practice technologies that leads directly to productivity improvements. You don't need, as Herb mentioned earlier in his introductory question, you don't have to do R&D to adopt best practice techniques as long as you're aware of those techniques. So adopting the best practice techniques is the best, most effective way to improve productivity performance. And that adoption is considered innovation. So there's obviously, that's really the key direct link. The diffusion of best practice techniques and the adoption by as many firms as possible of those techniques is the way to strengthen productivity growth. Now, a 4th point here on the linkage is that the in-house R&D capacity is considered essential by many for the identification and adoption of best practice technologies. But there's a debate about this because, first off, most firms in Canada, a very small number of firms actually take R&D. It's like 20,000 firms in Canada that actually have R&D programs. So most firms don't. So the path for productivity improvements for the vast majority of firms is basically the identification and adoption of best practice techniques. So I think if you do have in-house R&D capacity, that would certainly assist in that regard, but it's probably not fundamentally necessary, certainly, although some people say it is, other people say, well, it helps, but it's not. You still kind of, and the real world is there's many examples where firms adopt best practice techniques without R&D, but it certainly can help. Now, turning finally to policy directions to foster innovation, I'll just maybe give 3 points here for discussion purposes. Policies that encourage the adoption of best practice technologies, that's really the most important way, I think, to foster innovation, because that affects all firms, whereas R&D is done only by a small percentage of firms. The vast majority of firms do not undertake R&D, but and more importantly, almost all the technological advances in the world are taking place outside of New Brunswick. So New Brunswick businesses have to be aware of those advances and then adopt them where they feel it's cost effective and appropriate. That's really the path forward for productivity and innovation. Now, in addition, we need better linkages between applied researchers in post-secondary institutions and businesses. Those already exist, of course, but they have to be strengthened because applied researchers really can point the direction for in terms of the adoption of best practice techniques in particular for businesses. And then finally, more in immigrants with an entrepreneurial bent. Really, immigrants have driven innovation in many areas, and I think a larger number of immigrants who are entrepreneurially oriented would certainly foster innovation in the province. So I'll stop there, Herb. I hope I haven't gone over my time.
No, I think we're good. Before we go to the questions that have come in, could I ask for the second poll question to come up?
Yep.
So this sort of gets into the policy issues a bit that Andrew's been raising and some of the other challenges when we think about New Brunswick's performance. But we have to remember we're a small population province and we don't have the growth of GDP like some of the other places. So for a small province like New Brunswick to grow its R&D funding and performance, the first option is it just needs government to get out of the way of entrepreneurs. B, it just needs well-funded, high-performing university-based researchers. So that one's a bit of a shameless plug to pay us more at UNB, I guess. C, it just needs government to show leadership in developing funding assets and incentives conditions for a high-performing R&D system for entrepreneurs. D, it needs government to develop a targeted strategy for R&D to focus effort and funding on those areas where we're likely to see commercial success. E, it needs government to be a public entrepreneur, fully controlling and driving R&D for the province to overcome the unfixable deficiencies in the innovation ecosystem. And finally, if you don't like any of those, you can pick not sure, or this is a stupid poll question that missed the point. In which case I might ask you to some point offer in what would the point be. So it looks like we're at C as the most common, that basically we need government to show leadership in developing funding assets and incentives, and another strong group looking at government to develop targeted strategies. So again, Andrew, we're picking up a role for government in the small province innovation and R&D trajectories. With that in mind, there's a couple of good questions that have come up relating to data and some of the evidence. The first one is that one of the areas that's a growing interest is obviously the biggest, fastest growing sector in our economies of late seems to be the healthcare system. And so when we think about all of the R&D and research that goes on in healthcare and the healthcare system, where in the data you're presenting would R&D performed in the health system be captured in the data? And here we're thinking about health region activities and things like that.
Okay, well, healthcare. Well, basically, you're not talking about the development of pharmaceuticals. You're talking, are you? That certainly contributes to the healthcare system?
No, it would be more like the research I think that's done on better clinical practices, higher performing healthcare systems.
Well, some of that would be done by social sciences in the university sector. I think most of that would be in the university sector. In the business sector, it would be developed more of pharmaceuticals, the development of better equipment for hospitals. But in terms of the study of health, in terms of medical research, that's done largely in the university sector or in the government sector with government health institutes.
So if we
that shows up, and it's not in the business sector; it's more in the public sector.
So the response has come up in the Q&A pointing out that our two health regions, Horizon and Vitalite, spend substantially on health research internally. So would that be coming through government in the statistics? Because it wouldn't be higher ed in that case.
No, it would be government. They would be considered. I think they're funded by government, so they're considered part of the government sector for the point of view of statistics.
And just one other piece on that, because areas like digital health are becoming extremely important, but in a lot of cases, it would probably be the case that other than the identification of which sector it would be applied to, would it more generically just apply to software, that kind of development?
Well, if it's
digital business
software product that's linked to digital health, it would be picked up by the software sector in the business sector.
Okay, so again, it's with these statistics, we have to be careful in how we're defining the activity in determining
Absolutely.
where
You
it's
can
showing
always
up.
figure it out, but it takes a little while to do that. I would make one comment though about R&D in the health sector. That's not directly going to affect productivity. It's going to affect the well-being of Canadians. It's really important if we basically discover a disease, can cure a disease or something that will improve life expectancy, improve health outcomes, but that's not going to be picked up by in terms of our productivity statistics. It's not meant to be. It's not a criticism of that. We need that, but I'm just saying innovation affects not just productivity, but it affects our overall well-being, and the health is the best example of that.
Okay, great. Another attendee has asked, what's the evidence of the correlation between government spending and business performing R&D? This is a question that came up in Western Canada where there was a lot of government funding available. And there was always a debate about whether that funding was complementary to business performing R&D or if it actually crowded it out. So do we have a good sense of the correlation between government spending and business
Government
R&D?
spending on what? Government spending on R&D?
Yeah.
Okay. You mean, yeah, okay. Well, I don't think there's too much crowding out. We've seen a massive fall in government spending on R&D. The government labs are much less important now than they were in the past in terms of the total R&D picture. I don't really think there's a much crowding out of government spending. I think it's complementary to the overall effort basically of R&D in the university. Some people think that a university health situation is more productive for basic discoveries than a government lab is because of the incentive system and the best people are in universities. So I think the government has funded much more generously universities for R&D in recent years than it has its own government labs. There's been a preference for universities, and we saw that in the increase in funding for the universities, for the granting councils. They've been receiving additional funding in recent years. But I don't think there's really a big crowding out issue between the two. It's either done by one or the other, or there's just an additional research done.
But is there strong evidence that if we were to say take a greater government commitment to funding R&D activity or to support innovation, is there a strong positive correlation between businesses actually coming in to perform, or is it just we're getting activity, but we're not sure what the direct link to business R&D and later productivity growth will be?
Well, just wait. Are you saying government funding R&D? You mean for performing R&D in the government sector, or funding university R&D, or funding private sector R&D through tax credits? Which are you referring to?
Well, it could be. I guess we're looking for which levers does government have to encourage more R&D?
Well, they can just put more money in R&D. It might not be effective or not. You want to know what you can always throw money at R&D, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting bang for your buck and getting effectiveness. There's a big discussion of the effectiveness of R&D tax credits. Some people think that's not the way to go. What we should really be doing is identifying the industries that have the most potential for productivity growth in the future and funding those industries. The super clusters is an example of that. Let's see which industries can show that they have the potential and really need funding to get ahead in terms of innovation and productivity, and then fund them. You're kind of picking sectors in that sense. And Israel apparently has done that very effectively. And the Supercluster Initiative in Canada is another example of that.
So the supercluster for our region is obviously based in Halifax with the Oceans Supercluster. Just as an unfair question to you, if you had to pick a cluster opportunity for New Brunswick, are there any that spring to mind? We've got a lot of focus here on energy of late, smart grid innovation, small modular reactors, but are there others that come to mind when you think about New Brunswick?
Well, agriculture has potential. I hear you have a lot of potential for apples.
Right. Yeah, apples, blueberries are there.
So I think the food processing industry is important in New Brunswick. So that would be one area. I haven't really thought about it. Ocean, there's certainly proximity to oceans in New Brunswick. So I think hopefully the Atlantic can work together on the oceans. It's not just a Nova Scotia issue. New Brunswick also has a future in oceans with aquaculture in the Fundy area. So there's a lot. I think it shouldn't just be a Nova Scotia issue. It should be a maritime or Atlantic issue. Oceans.
Okay. We have a question about patent data. Patent filing by New Brunswick residents are on the rise, but do we have any information on patent ownership licenses to NB headquartered companies?
Yeah.
And might that trend tell us something different?
Well, that would be a good question. I'm not really an expert on patents, and I don't really know. I doubt it would be. I don't think it would tell a different story. I think New Brunswick would still be at the lowest end among the province, one of the lowest in terms of provincial patenting activity. It's completely consistent with the overall R&D story. Again, patents can also depend on incentives that university researchers have to do it. Is it do they sell it to a firm or do they take it out themselves? There's a lot of IP issues associated with patenting, so I don't really have a detailed answer for that one. And we haven't done, other than look at the statistics on patenting, we haven't done a study of what firms in New Brunswick do the patenting. Is it university based? Is it based with firms or government or whatever? That would be an interesting study.
So yeah, it would be nice if we could get someone on that to sort of show us what these patents are, where they're located, things along those lines.
Right.
So that would be an avenue for research, I guess, is our usual conference response. Turning back to factors that affect innovation and growth, one of the questions that we always need to think about is capacity of, let's say, a public sector to support R&D, and to what extent is, this is a tough one to get at because it gets a bit of causality, is slow growth an impetus to do more R&D and innovation, or is slow growth what holds us back because we can't resource it if we don't have the margins in our economy to provide the resources to these initiatives?
Mm-hmm.
So do we look at an economy that's growing rapidly and we see lots of R&D and innovation and we interpret that as R&D and innovation is causing it? Or is it a symptom, in which case we need to fix our growth problems so we can get R&D?
Yeah, right.
Or do we start with R&D to get our growth?
Well, again, it's a chicken and egg situation here. I think both play a role. Both have an effect. Obviously, if New Brunswick was growing really rapidly, there'd be a lot of more tax revenue. That government could therefore fund more R&D. Businesses would have higher profits, and they could use that for R&D. So that would feed on itself. On the other hand, if just putting money in R&D, that may or may not induce growth. I wouldn't count on just throwing money on R&D to all of a sudden become a strong economy in terms of growth. Growth is linked to shocks to the system, resource shock. We see in Canada, particularly resource shocks that have been the key drivers of growth, as I mentioned, in Newfoundland and Labrador, and out west, or manufacturing shocks where all of a sudden you have a low exchange rate and therefore your exports to the United States go up. That would really, or let's say all of a sudden there's a new demand for toilet paper, and New Brunswick can produce massive amounts of toilet paper. And that would be a really growth shock, and that would be positive for the economy, independent of R&D. So I don't think you can look to throwing money in R&D for government to get the economy going. And again, it's got to be it's got to come from the entrepreneurs themselves. They're the ones that really lead. They're the ones that make the decision that they want to do R&D, and that hopefully they can come up with a new product, and that new product can be sold widely and therefore generate jobs and employment. The example here in Ottawa is Shopify. It was a small firm, started off as 15 years ago, and now it has the largest capitalization on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and it's created thousands of jobs and many tens of millionaires here in Ottawa. So you need those small tech firms that all of a sudden can blossom and grow and bring along economic development. That's what New Brunswick needs. But it's easy to say that, much harder to do that. Just have to make sure you cultivate and develop the environment for that. And New Brunswick has done that in the past with some of its high-tech firms that did well in the early 2000s, and they have been sold out, and now they're branch plants, and you need some new high-tech firms that can develop and become headquartered companies in the region.
Great. We have a question that's come in. How do we encourage businesses to take on or adapt new technologies? So what are some ways that we could incent that or encourage it?
Right. Well, that's a really good question. And that's really the essential of economic growth, is develop these new technologies. What happened in the United States historically, and in Canada as well, for agriculture, you basically had the government develop agricultural research stations to develop new crops and new disease-resistant crops and so on. And so the government played a key role in diffusing best practices among farmers. And so there is a role for government in the identification of best practice techniques and the diffusion with entrepreneurs. Now, entrepreneurs, of course, always have an incentive to do that themselves. It's just they may not have the resources. So industry associations also can play a role in pointing their members to the best practice techniques and technologies. So I think the government can do that through better information sharing, and of course giving incentives for development investment in machinery equipment. They already have that now. So government can play a role there, but again, we just can't have government. It's got to be the entrepreneurs themselves, the business themselves, that take the leadership role, and they're supported by government.
So related to that point, you brought up a determinant of or importance of this was in-house R&D, that you had people that could identify what best practices were and bring them in. In a lot of cases, we have small-sized enterprises in New Brunswick, and an interesting feature here is we have government created, in some cases supported agencies or institutions that are playing some of that role. So we have the Research Productivity Council that does a lot of applied research to help companies work on fixing bottlenecks and becoming more productive generally. We have NBIF, the New Brunswick Innovation Foundation, which supports bringing in highly qualified personnel and some of the university researchers. Mm-hmm. We have a COA, which has a productivity program working with manufacturers, among others. And then we also have Opportunities New Brunswick, which is operating in this space about making information known available. So is this a case where do we have too many? Are they underfunded?
Well,
what would the advice be to?
I'm not an expert in terms of the effectiveness of these organizations, so I really can't comment. One you didn't mention that's really effective is the National Research Council has the IRAP program. And businesses really love that because in addition to providing technical advice, it also provides funding for the adoption of new technologies. So there are many programs that do it. And so I think we've recognized the importance of this. Maybe these organizations probably could argue that if they had more resources, they could do an even better job. And I think government should look at their proposals if they feel they can do a better job. But I think these organizations play an important role in the diffusion of best practice techniques among small and medium-sized businesses.
So as we're heading towards the end of our time, I want to bring in one question that we get a lot whenever we try to talk about innovation and R&D, which is there's a growing interest in social innovation and where it would appear in the statistics, how we would potentially think about capturing the benefits from it if it's not going to be in productivity and industry, or perhaps it is if by creating a better standard of living or quality of life in the region, we attract labor. Do you have any thoughts on how social innovation fits into how we track the statistics and measure the activity that's going on?
Well, I guess we first have to agree on what we mean by social innovation. Do we mean the development of small nonprofits that are trying to bring people together and have new approaches to social problems? I don't really know the standard definition of social innovation. I assume it doesn't mean doing R&D. It's not the standard R&D type model. I think it's an important area, and we also have, I get there also could be the development of basically nonprofit organizations developing social policies that can be funded by government that would basically improve the well-being of members of society. So anything that if social innovation can help overall economic well-being, I think that's great. We should be going into it, but I'd have to know what particular aspect of social innovation we're dealing with here. But it's not right now part of our standard framework for capturing innovation. Let's put it that way.
And one final unfair question, I'll try and ask it in a friendly way, but you brought up the importance of business university partnerships as a potential way to have effective R&D that it gets into the productivity of your industrial base, let's say. Do you have examples that you would point to as best practice for those types of partnerships so that we could learn how it's structured, how it's set up, or why it works? Or are there just general thoughts on what types of incentives lead to these partnerships?
Well, first off, there's the universities are really the incubator of all sorts of ideas that innovation. An example of the unicorn in the woods, and basically the two firms that high-tech firms that developed in New Brunswick came out of UNB. Staff there came up with ideas and they were commercialized. So I think universities are essential. And it's the universities that lead to entrepreneurs coming out of them, either professors or students, so that their universities are really essential for the development of new technologies. In terms of partnerships, again, I haven't really worked directly in that area. I think they're important, and we actually did a major study of this about 10 years ago, looking at different countries, and we found Australia in particular was very effective in that regard. They already exist to a great degree, and I think the importance of them is well recognized, but I don't really have a list of the best practices in that area. It depends also on the IP regulations and how much the research in universities can be used in the private sector, and whether the developer of an idea in university can patent that themselves, or the patent goes to the university. So there's a lot of IP regulations that affect that. But I think if you look at the role of Stanford University in developing the IP, the Silicon Valley area, that's been a really good example of these key linkages from universities to business development.
That's great. Well, we're heading to the top of the hour, so I'd like to do two things. One is to let the attendees know to keep an eye out for webinars we'll be offering on November 27th and December 4th. On November 27th, we'll be sharing our first analysis of the technological maturity data that we've been collecting on manufacturers in the province. And that will hopefully have a panel discussion as well about what it all means and what the options are for getting more advanced manufacturing and productivity increase into that sector. And on December 4th, we're going to be having a panel discussing options for making better competitiveness of our exporting manufacturers as a source of GDP growth going forward. The details on who's on the panel and what we'll be discussing will be coming forward, but please keep an eye on our JDI Roundtable on Manufacturing Competitiveness for information on those, and also emails if you've signed up. But my final task today is a very pleasant one, to thank Andrew for a great presentation today and answering the questions for us. And thanks again, Andrew, for taking the time to do this.
My pleasure.
And Andrew's work is available on our website, the Roundtable, but also the Center for the Study of Living Standards, where you can also find a lot more great studies on often detailed industries, including pulp and paper in the region, if you want to get a bigger picture look at that. So again, I hope everyone enjoys the great weather we appear to be having this weekend, and hope to see you on November 27th. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.